Hello, I just wanted to make a small video about some information I found out off the internet about some bead patterns and things and some freebies. This is all about budget beading. I made this bracelet on a loom using 4mm cube beads. I don't know where I got them. I've had them for a long time, but like I haven't made a video in a while because I haven't had, you know, like very nice expensive beads to, you know, to show off. So I, you know, went into my stash and I found these 4mm squares and I made it on a loom. I made it using a typical craft loom, just like this. The other side of it, and this one cost me like $9 at Joann's. And a lot of people have this, and there's a lot of YouTube videos out there about looming, so this is not going to be about looming. I don't have the definition on my camera to make that kind of video. Anyway, and I made earrings to go with it. I had, you know, leftover beads and I didn't want to waste them, so I made earrings to go with it. Now I was not going to restring this whole loom to make just these two. They're 2 cubes wide, and you know, they're the color spectrum of the beads that I have. They're like 3, 6, 8 beads long. I wasn't going to restring that whole loom just to loom up 2 earrings, but I wanted my earrings, and I didn't want to just plop the beads on a head pin and call it a day. But I did want my earrings to mimic the loomed look that you get when you stitch things together. So what I did was I used square stitch to loom them, and I'm going to give a little brief demonstration of square stitch. Since I don't have good definitions, this is not going to be like a tutorial on square stitch. There are tutorials on YouTube about square stitch and elsewhere. Lots of free information you can get. It's also called faux loom, F-A-U-X, meaning fake loom. It's a way to get the loomed look if you don't have a loom. Now, if you don't have a loom, Elizabeth June Jean, I think, on YouTube, she has a video on how you can make your own basic loom out of a picture frame and push pins. So, but if you don't even have that in your house, if you have no craft loom, no picture frame and push pins, but you do have a loom pattern that you have your heart set on, you can do it in square stitch. So let me set up my needle and thread, and I'll give you a brief demonstration. Okay. Normally, when you loom a pattern, you can see, you know, what row you start with, and that's how many beads you put on. Same thing with square stitch, except that unlike square stitch is unlike looming in that your beads are going to be held in place once you get those first couple of rows started by the warp threads that are going lengthwise on the loom. And in square stitch, you've got to hold on to the piece with your own hands. That's why it's advisable, first of all, to measure out a full arm's worth of thread. Keep the thread in one hand on the bobbin. Stretch it out, you know, stretch, you know, your arms out, both arms out, and that's really the length that you should start with, or more. So imagine this was my pattern, and it's 3 beads across. My pattern is 3 beads wide, I should say, or 3 beads across, 3 beads wide. To do square stitch, you pick up all the beads of the very first row. 1, 2, 3. You bring them down. You would leave on a tail, like 8 inches, maybe even a foot, because you would want to use that end to sew in a clasp. I'm going to use a bead stopper just for the purpose of this this demonstration, I'm using large beads, you know, because the definition on this camera is really bad, and I want you to get a good idea, at least, of what I'm trying to do here. If you were using seed beads, you'd put on, you know, a bead and go through it a couple of times to make it as a bead stopper. Now, you proceed to whatever the next row is going to be. And square stitch is a little bit like ladder stitch, except with ladder stitch, you're picking up one bead to start with, and you're stitching through it once you pick up the second bead. With square stitch, you pick up all the beads of your base row. So here is the first bead going from, I'm right-handed, so I'm going from right to left. The first bead of the second row. This one doesn't have a workable hole. Okay, this one does. Bring that bead, I'm going to try to get front in the camera. Bring that bead all the way down to the beads, the 3 beads in the first row you've already strung. And then, yes, the bead will drop right back down if you don't hold it. You're going to go, holding your work, you're going to sort of go down through this last bead of the first row, pointing the needle towards yourself. Pull through, and as you do so, the bead you just picked up, of the first bead of the second row, will lock in next to, or slot in next to, the bead it's supposed to. The bead that the pattern says it's supposed to lay on top of. And to make sure it stays there, you then go through the bead you just picked up, the first bead of the second row, with the needle going away from you. And there you have it. This green bead would be the second bead of the second row. Pull it down. And even though, like, you'd be probably working it as a bracelet, it's going to progress this way, lengthwise, you know, the way my fingers are pointing. You're actually stitching it, you know, even though you're, you know, it's gonna grow vertically, you're actually stitching horizontally. I guess that's what I want to say. You take the second bead of the second row, put it through the second bead of the first row. Now, some instructions, I'm going to pause here, some instructions say you should go down through the first bead of the first row as well. And don't let me be the one to tell you not to. Every time you go through a bead, as your thread goes through the bead and fills it up, your work gets stiffer. Now, if this is your first row, you're going to want to be able to sew on a clasp at the end. So I like to leave these beads with as little thread in them as possible. So I'm not going to go through the first bead of the first row. I'm just going to go through the second bead of the second row, because that's the bead I want this second bead of the second row to lock down to. Again, pulling the thread and pointing the needle towards myself, pulling the thread towards myself, or towards yourself. And then you go back through that bead, pulling the needle and thread away from yourself. And it'll be a little loose. That first row will be a little loose. Tension is important. Oh, this bead doesn't work. Okay, now I have the last bead of the second row. I bring it up next to the last bead of the first row. I go down through the last bead of the first row. pointing the needle towards myself, pulling the thread towards myself. Then I go back through the bead that I just picked up, pulling the needle away from myself, pulling the thread away from myself. And what you have is two nice little rows that, if you keep going, following your pattern, it will look like loom work, but you didn't loom it. So if you have your heart set on a loom pattern, all power to you, and no loom at home, all power to you, just square stitch it. Now, having said that, I also wanted to make mention of other things about loom work. Sometimes when you make a loomed cuff, you find that it's wide. Certainly my piece is wide with 4mm beads. My piece is, I don't know. Oops, I have a magnetic clasp attached to it. Let me see how wide this is. My piece is about 1 inch wide. So it's hard to find, you know, if you're looking for a type of bar type clasp that goes over, you know, that exactly matches the width of your work, sometimes you won't find that. So what you can do is take 2 smaller clasps and stitch them on in between the beads. It's hard to see here, but the thread is coming out in between the last 2 beads and the 3rd bead on either side. And magnetic clasps make great loom work clasps because loom work cuffs are not meant to be loose and hanging down. They're meant to like sit right on your wrist. And with a magnetic, and you know, with that, it's kind of hard to, you know, work a toggle or a lobster claw clasp. But with a magnetic clasp, the magnets want to go together. So they just, if I could show you, they just sort of, you just lay it around your wrist and the magnets just lock into place. The downside with the magnetic clasp is that since they want to stay magnetized, you really do have to tug them to take them off. And that's where your bracelet will get the most wear and tear. So be sure you stitch on any clasp that's magnetic very firmly. Okay, now for some, well, you know, that was kind of budget beading too, because, you know, if you've got a loom pattern, like there are lots of free patterns on the internet for bead weaving. There's free peyote stitch patterns, free loom patterns, free herringbone patterns, you name it in bead weaving, and you can find a free pattern. Now, it may not be a pattern you like, but you can usually find a free pattern. You can also find free loom graph paper. You can find free peyote pattern paper if you want to draw your own. So that brings me to more stuff I wanted to talk about. Free stuff to aid in your budget beading. First thing that may be obvious to other people but was news to me. If you order beads online, and sometimes if you go, I think this tube is the kind of tube that the Toho beads come in Michaels. They have a CB section that's Toho, and they sell their beads in these tubes. These kind of tubes, and if you order online, sometimes you'll get your seed beads in these tubes, make excellent holders for your head pins and your eye pins. Because say you have some very nice eye pins, I have some decorative head ones here, and you don't want them to bend. If you store them, what I used to do, store them in these type of Ziploc bags. Well, not those, actually. I have larger ones somewhere. Ah, here we go. These kind of bags, they will get bent, because what you're doing once you store them in this bag, you're putting them in some other container or a drawer, or just, you know, tossing them down in, you know, oh, that's the spot where I keep all my gold findings. These are great for keeping your head pins and your eye pins unbent, and especially when you buy them in the craft store, they tend to be thinner gauge metal. They bend very easily, and once metal bends, it creates a stress point, so that when, you know, you can say, oh, well, I can just unbend it. Yes, you can unbend it, but at that stress point, from it being bent and then unbent, it's likely that your head pin will break off, or your eye pin will break off at that spot, and that's not good, especially if you're going to do wire wraps with them. You want as much length on that head pin as you can. So that's one budget way. Obviously, you could use these things to store the beads that they came in, but don't throw them away, because you have more storage options. The second budget beading tip or info I had was searching all over the internet. I discovered, now, when you have a loom pattern, it's always in a grid form. Like this one's 13 beads wide, but it's always, you know, one row, one row, one row after another. Well, I was looking on the internet for, you know, under bead looms, and I found a site called klutz.com, K-L-U-T-Z, and it sells children's crafts. And there is nothing wrong, I'm an adult, there's nothing wrong with buying, say, a bead loom that was made, you know, for ages 10 and up. You know, this bead loom was made for ages 10 and up. And, you know, as long as it works, use it. Well, on their site, on the site, klutz.com, where they had the bead loom, if I can find, yes, they had, when you click onto that particular kit, it was a bead loom bracelet kit, and it comes with loom and beads. It also has a little button that you can click on, and it gives you free graph paper for making just bands. 4 wide, 5 wide, 6 wide, 7 wide, excuse me. 3, 4, 5, and 6 wide. So if you go to their site and you can print this out, you can just, you know, you don't even have to worry about finding graph paper. You can just, and it's free, by the way. I didn't pay anything to get this. You can just, you know, design your own little band for loom or what I just showed you, square stitch. So it's, you know, it's a way to save money. Also on the klutz.com site, they had a kit called safety pin bracelets. And apparently safety pin bracelets are a big thing among teenagers and tweenagers and stuff. And they're fairly inexpensive to make. A lot of people have made them, you know, in camp or things like that. It's almost like friendship bracelets, except that they use safety pins and elastic and beads. Well, if you click on the safety pin bracelet kit, and when you click on their site, they have a section which says, you know, what's inside. And you can click on, and it'll show you, you know, a sample of the beads and a sample of the page, a page of the workbook that the kit comes with. And I found these patterns. I don't know if they're coming in. And it occurred to me that lining up the beads on the safety pin is just like lining up the beads on a graph, you know, or lining up the beads the same way for a loom. So if you could find some free safety pin patterns, you also then have free loom patterns. And these are cute. These are fish. This says it's waves, flowers. So there's that. If you subscribe to the newsletter for Beading Daily, they have free ebooks. And they have free ebooks for free necklace patterns, free bracelet patterns. This week's free ebook, they don't have them every week, they don't have them every month, but this week they had a free ebook, Beading Daily, that's what it's called, for earrings, like 6 designs of earrings, and I printed out the ones that I liked, absolutely free. It cost me, well, okay, nothing's absolutely free. If I make these patterns, it will cost me in beads if I don't have beads that are equivalent to what they have. And of course, I'm using up ink, so I'm paying, you know, that price too. But again, it's, you know, it's not, you know, just a picture, it's the actual instructions on how to do it. And last but not least, if you see a pattern for, say, a loom, if you're just starting out and you don't really, you know, have any artistic talent like myself, and you know, you don't want to, or you don't have the money to spend to buy patterns, sometimes, and this is kind of cheating, but sometimes, if they give you a picture of the finished product, or they give you a picture of a sample of a section, you can, if you print out that graphic, you know, it says print picture, you know, click on it, right click on it to print picture, and you blow it up on the screen, you can sometimes count the beads across, figure out how many beads wide it is, and work from that photo to make your pattern without having bought the pattern. Yes, it's a little bit of cheating. I don't think it's damaging to the artist who put the pattern up there, because we're talking about jewelry. You know, I'm not making 10 of these. I'm making one of these for me. I don't have an Etsy shop or anything else like that. If you're trying, yes, it's illegal if you're going to rip off someone's pattern or try to duplicate it and then sell it on Etsy. I mean, chances are the pattern maker herself is on Etsy, so she's going to see her pattern being sold. But I'll give you an example. This is a pattern that I found on the internet. It was a sample on it, and I didn't know how to loom a heart. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I don't have that kind of talent to, like, and I don't want to string up my loom, go to the trouble, string up my loom and start warping, you know, warp the loom and string on beads, and, you know, then have to unstring everything because it's not working out like I thought it was. So since I wanted to know how to particularly do this, I was able to blow this picture up, count how many beads there were across, and now I know how to loom this heart shape. So those are all my tips for budget beading and making do with what you've got, because we'd all rather spend the money on the beads. we really don't want to spend the money and, you know, the needle and thread and stuff that we need. We don't really want to spend the money on buying patterns if we don't really have to. So there's a wealth of resources out there, and I'm availing myself of them, and I hope that you do, in, you know, the name of getting your beading hobby on and keeping within your budget. Thank you. Oh, and thank you to anyone and everyone who subscribed to me. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.